One of the ways in which we can measure the importance and the significance of war in our contemporary world is through the lens of economics, and particularly of global military expenditure. So here we have a graph of world military expenditure produced in the annual SIPRI report, which shows the expenditure over the last 30 years. In 2019, a total of $1.9 trillion were expended by all states on their military resources. And if we look at it over a longer period, over the 30 years that the table displays for us, the graph displays for us, we can see some trends. We can see a decline in military budgets in the aftermath of the Cold War until at least the mid to late 1990s, an increase in the 2000s, again thinking about the context of the war on terror, and something of a plateau in the 2010s with an increase in the last few years picking up again. It's quite plausible that budgets may decrease again with the impacts of the pandemic, putting strains on government budgets, but that still remains to be seen. We could also note certain trends, certain geographic trends, with the growth of the share of Asia and Oceania, and the relative and the fluctuations of the Americas, which effectively, of course, reflects US expenditure. If we break down this data into individual states, some quite notable trends emerge. One is, and this will probably not come as a surprise, is the preponderance of the United States. The US accounts for 38% of global military expenditure. In the last year, it expended $730 billion on its armed forces. Now, actually, if we look at the period of the last 10 years, we can see, in fact, that its absolute spending has declined by about 15%, and accordingly, the US share has actually been falling somewhat over the last 10 years. This, of course, can partly be accounted for by the drawdown in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have seen budgets fall after a number of years of increase. But it should be noted, the last few years of the Trump administration, we've seen budgets increase again, with external threats of China and Russia being talked up significantly. When we look at the next state, we find China. China, with $261 billion of expenditure, accounts for 14% of the world share, and a share that's increased by 85% over the last 10 years. That reflects well what we know about the growing role of China in world affairs, and then reflects also its greater prosperity, and therefore the proportion of GDP that it can spend. In fact, as we see, the proportion of GDP has not increased. It's estimated to be about 1.9% in 2010 as it is in 2019, but mechanically, through the enrichment of China, this results in increasing expenditure. Behind that, we find actually players with considerably less expenditure. So India, Russia, or Saudi Arabia. So Russia, that's presented as a military superpower, still spends 10 times less than the United States on its defense, and the share has increased by about 30% in the last 10 years, but it still remains far behind the United States. Likewise with European states whose budgets have been fairly flat. I mean, they've decreased, in fact, in the United Kingdom by about 15% over the last 10 years. So the United States remains, by far the predominant military force in the world today, certainly by levels of expenditure. In fact, its budget, totals about the accumulated expenditure of about the 9 next military powers. So this is still a world where, although US power may be declining in other ways, in other marked ways, so economically, in terms of soft power and so on, it's quite clear the United States' power has receded. In military terms, although in absolute terms or in proportional terms it is shrinking somewhat, its lead remains very significant. There's another way in which the US is quite unique, and is that it's really the only military power to have a global projection. The US operates around 800 overseas military bases around the world, and this compares really very favorably with about 30 bases if we were to combine all the overseas bases possessed by all other nations. So it's a completely different order of magnitude. The US has a global footprint, its armies can be projected anywhere across the world, and no other country possesses anything similar. We could also look at war as a big business and look at the arms producers and the exports and importers, what makes effectively the arms trade sale. And what we see is we're looking at at annual sales of arms producers of around $400 billion. So this is it's a very large kind of area of economic production. Of course, most of these sales are made internally, supplying national armies, but there is an international arms trade worth around $50 billion. And if you look at this graph, we can see who the major exporters and importers are. Major exporters, again, no surprise, the United States features prominently, but Russia is also a major exporter, accounting for 20% of world trade. European states remain significant exporters. And then we have major areas of importation. Chief among them, the Middle East, and the leader among them, Saudi Arabia. Again, you can read quite a lot of trends in global politics from this. Notably the relationships and the links between arms exporters and arms importers, the relationship of Western countries with Saudi Arabia, for instance, or Egypt for that matter, which also features as a significant arms importer. The business of war is also reflected in the development of private military companies. It's a growing market of companies that provide armed force for sale. The estimates of this market are quite difficult to come by, because some of it is quite nebulous and opaque, but some estimates value this market at around $100 billion. And it should be noted that these private military companies are not only mercenaries fighting for warlords in Africa. These private military companies have huge markets servicing Western military forces. There's a lot of work has been outsourced. Now, to be clear, most of this work is not combat roles. It's logistics, it's supplies, and or local security, and so forth. But it remains a very large market and a very large activity. At the peak of deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan at the end of the 2000s, it was estimated there were around 200,000 military contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is a major activity, a major source of revenue, and we can only expect it to grow further, including in the kind of most controversial combat roles. One of the ways in which war interacts with the economy, but also through technological development, because there's a very long list of key technologies, ones that have defined the world in which we live in, that have been developed through war effort. One might think, for example, of the development of nuclear energy, of the computer, the internet, the mobile phone, rockets, GPS, satellites. All these technologies, many of which form the backbone of the information society that we live in, come from or were driven by military imperatives, funded at early stages by military research and development funds. Indeed, if you take something like the iPhone, the ubiquitous smartphone, we can see how a whole ream of technologies have fed into that device, such as battery technology, signal compression, liquid crystal displays, microprocessors, cellular technology, voice recognition, the internet, and so forth. What we know as the smartphone, the compressed computer that we carry in every one of our pockets, all of this would be impossible without major military research and development and the impetus to develop these weapons for the ends of war. Here again, the United States stands out as quite singular. The US military's R&D budget in 2015 amounted to Russia's total defense expenditure in that year. So the United States spent close to $65 billion on military research and development, and it is as much as Russia spent on its entire armed forces. So when we think about the prominence of the United States in military terms, we also have to be mindful that this is captured also in a technological edge and a pursuit of a technological edge that has been persistent. One might also perhaps think about the place in the history of the 20th century of the space race, including the race to reach the moon, which in many ways served as a proxy war. Not only because there was a prestige in attaining the milestones of being the first humans in space or the first to land on the moon, but also because the occupation of space took on strategic importance. Might be for the posting of space weapons such as nuclear devices, or it might be development of spy satellites or global positioning satellites. Space was recognized very early on as a key strategic arena, and of course this is being redoubled today, partly through kind of the beginnings of a new space race with growing interest by China and other states in space exploration, but also of course the recent announcement of a space force by the Trump administration. The space has always been a military space in a sense, but one where weapons have been, through international agreement, prohibited. It seems very likely that they are going to re-enter that arena in a fairly short order.